The wind off Lake Michigan cut through Wyoming like a knife, biting at the skin, stealing warmth, and carrying the faint smell of rusted metal from the abandoned Avery's auto body. Patrolman Dewey Mac McMillan's flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam falling on something that should not have been there. Half buried in the frozen dirt, tangled among discarded tires and oil-stained rags, lay Alice Collins. At 25, she had been a spark of life, a laughter that lingered, fragile as a bell. Now, she was motionless, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the void of a night that had stolen her future. Her coat, once white and stylish, was shredded from collar to hem, a violent map of her final struggle. Fingers, pale and broken, clawed at the hard ground as though she could pull herself from the grip of the earth that had claimed her. Drag marks scarred the frozen dirt, leading tantalizingly close to the asphalt, a mere 50 feet from freedom, but her body had been dragged back, submission forced. The contrast of her delicate figure against the harsh, dirty earth was grotesque, impossible to ignore. Every officer on the scene felt it. This was not a random accident. It was cruelty made tangible, carved into the frozen, November night. Detective Sergeant Ford Kincaid arrived moments later, his breath visible in the bitter air. Years of facing death in Korea had prepared him for many horrors, but nothing could steel him for the sight of Alice Collins. The desperate tension frozen on her face, eyes wide with pleading terror, was a mirror to every officer's instinctual need to protect. Yet there was nothing they could do. The cold was absolute. The silence was absolute. And the injustice, that unbearable, suffocating injustice, was absolute. A question burned in every mind at the scene, one that would echo through decades. How could someone capable of this walk unnoticed among the living? The answer was not here, not yet. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. The first shock had already gripped Wyoming, Michigan, like ice water in the veins. The quiet streets, the familiar faces, the sense of safety, they had all been shattered in an instant. Ford knew that the night would linger in his memory forever, and that Alice's silent plea would haunt not only him, but an entire community, for decades to come. The ground itself seemed to hold a memory of Alice's struggle. Half-frozen dirt clung to her shredded coat and broken fingers, each mark a testament to the terror she had endured. Drag lines etched into the earth were cruel reminders. She had fought, resisted, tried to flee, but the night had been merciless. Every officer staring at the scene felt an unspoken rage rise, a simmering anger at the audacity of someone who could snuff out a life so violently, leaving almost nothing behind. Alice's delicate hands were fractured, stained crimson against the dull brown earth. Her nails had been torn, her fingers twisted unnaturally. The officers could not look away, even as their stomachs turned. Each detail, the torn fabric, the bruises, the mud caked under fingernails, was a message of unmitigated cruelty. She had been inches from escape, mere moments from the road that could have been her salvation, but her killer had dragged her back, determined and cold. Ford Kincaid knelt by her side, the winter air stinging his face, the weight of helplessness pressing on his chest. His hands hovered over the scene but dared not touch. He traced the drag marks with his eyes, counting the steps she had taken in her final fight. It was a map of desperation, etched into dirt and frozen time, impossible to ignore. He felt the surge of helplessness turn into a quiet, burning fury, a relentless need to seek justice for a life stolen so violently. And yet, amid the horror, Ford noticed the subtle things, the faint smear of shoe prints near the road, the way her coat had partially caught on a tire, the struggle frozen in the way her body lay. Every minute detail was a story in itself, a narrative of courage in her final moments. It was a story that demanded to be heard, one that would linger in the hearts of everyone who dared to confront the truth. The town of Wyoming would never see that night the same way again. The quiet streets seemed smaller, the familiar homes colder. Anger and fear coiled together like twin serpents in the chest of anyone who saw the scene. That night, the community realized that innocence could be ripped away in seconds, leaving only raw pain and questions that refused to fade. Alice's eyes stared, wide and unblinking, into the cold November night. They were fixed on the asphalt of Chicago Drive, so close she could almost have touched it, so close she could have escaped. The silent terror etched in her gaze spoke of a struggle that had lasted too long and of a desperate hope that had ended too soon. Ford Kincaid felt a pang of helplessness tighten in his chest, the haunting realization that her final moments had been a fight against impossible odds. Her head was twisted unnaturally, a frozen plea for salvation that had come too late. It was the look of someone who had known betrayal, violence, and fear in its rawest form. Every line of her face screamed anger, pain, and loss, demanding that someone, anyone, bear witness to the injustice. Officers stood around, quiet and shaken, understanding that no words could fill the silence of that desperate gaze. Even decades later, Ford would recall that expression with vivid clarity. It was more than terror, it was a message. She had fought, she had resisted, and yet, in those last precious seconds, the world had failed her. That frozen stare became a symbol, not only of Alice's struggle, but of the decades of unanswered questions that would haunt the town and every person who knew her story. The community, seeing the lifeless body of a young woman who had been full of hope, experienced a shock that would ripple across Wyoming for years. That glance, trapped forever in the darkness, was a mirror reflecting fear, injustice, and the silent rage that anyone who learned her story would carry forward. The first officers on the scene moved with a mix of shock and disbelief. Mac McMillan's hands shook as he radioed for backup, his voice barely steady. Ford Kincaid stood a few feet away, staring at Alice's lifeless body, the cold November air biting at his skin, while rage and sorrow roared silently in his chest. He had seen death in many forms, but this was calculated, cruel, and utterly senseless. Whispers began spreading through the small Wyoming community almost immediately. Neighbors, friends, and those who had known Alice could scarcely believe that such violence had invaded their streets. Every familiar face suddenly felt suspicious. Every shadowed corner seemed to harbor unseen threats. Fear and anger intertwined, leaving an ache that would linger in the town's bones for years. Ford felt the weight of failure press on him. The image of Alice's wide, pleading eyes would haunt him for decades, a reminder that justice had not yet arrived. He bent closer to the frozen drag marks leading toward the road, tracing the steps she had taken in her last desperate moments. Each line in the dirt whispered of a life interrupted, a story cut short, and a question unanswered for 57 years. Even as the night settled over Wyoming, one truth became painfully clear. This was more than a murder. It was a wound inflicted on an entire community, one that would fester in silence until someone finally dared to confront the shadows left behind. Wyoming, Michigan, a town that had once moved with the gentle rhythm of familiarity, suddenly felt alien. The streets, once calm and quiet, seemed smaller, narrower, as neighbors cast sideways glances at one another. Conversations grew hushed. Doors were closed a little faster. Mothers clutched their children tightly, their hands trembling, their voices low, carrying warnings that had never before been necessary. Even the usual gathering spots, the brass rail, the diner on the corner, the small church on Chicago Drive buzzed with tension, as if the air itself had become heavy with suspicion. Before we go any further, I need to confess something. My wife said there's no way this channel will hit 1,000 subscribers before Saturday. She even laughed. Please don't let her win this. Hit that subscribe button, it's free, and help me walk into the living room like a champion. Alice Collins had been a bright presence, a young woman whose laugh carried through rooms like sunlight spilling across a floor. In memory, neighbors spoke of her sketches pinned to bedroom walls, the way she paused to watch the seasons change, the hope she carried in every word she spoke. That hope now felt stolen, replaced by the fear that the person capable of such violence could be anyone, anywhere, hidden behind a familiar face. Whispers spread quickly, each one growing louder in the quiet spaces between houses. Who had seen something? Who had said too little? Who had walked past Alice on that last night without noticing the danger? Everyone became a suspect, not by evidence, but by the sheer impossibility of knowing who could commit such an act. Even children sensed the change. They asked questions their parents could not answer. Friends who had played together for years no longer laughed as freely. The community had been forced into a collective state of hyper-awareness, a nervous vigilance fueled by grief and rage. And through it all, the memory of Alice's gentle vibrancy made the terror even more unbearable, a cruel contrast to the darkness that had descended over a town that had believed itself safe. Every corner of Wyoming seemed to hold a secret, every familiar face a potential threat. Strangers were noticed immediately, vehicles idling longer than necessary, footsteps echoing too loudly on quiet streets, doors opening and closing with unusual haste. Even the most mundane actions were scrutinized, measured against a backdrop of fear. The town's rhythm had shifted. Ordinary moments now carried an undercurrent of tension that no one could shake. Conversations at the diner were punctuated by uneasy silences. Patrons lowered their voices when discussing the night Alice disappeared. Each glanced toward the doorway carrying suspicion. Gossip spread quickly, sometimes accurate, often distorted, and every story became evidence in the minds of neighbors. Trust, once given freely, had become a rare currency. People who had shared coffee and laughter for decades now studied each other warily, wondering who could harbor violence behind a polite smile. Churches and community halls, once places of solace, became spaces for whispered speculation. Mothers and fathers whispered warnings to their children. Strangers were quietly monitored, and routine evening walks turned into exercises in caution. The sense of safety had evaporated entirely, replaced by a pervasive anxiety that tightened its grip with every passing day. Amid the fear, the memory of Alice's vibrant personality lingered like a stubborn flame. She had been a dreamer, a painter of quiet beauty, a woman whose energy had touched many lives. That memory made the threat even more unbearable. Her absence was not only a loss of life, but a void in the town's sense of normalcy. A reminder that the violence had struck someone innocent, someone beloved, and that the culprit could be walking among them right now. Detective Ford Kincaid and his team scoured Wyoming, retracing every step Alice had taken that night, but the town yielded only shadows. Witnesses' memories blurred with time and fear. Each account contradicted the next. Interviews stretched long into the night. And yet, the answers everyone craved remained maddeningly out of reach. The evidence was minimal, frustratingly so. Footprints in the frozen ground were smudged or obscured, drag marks partially erased by snow and wind. Tiny fibers beneath Alice's nails offered hope, but none led to the truth the investigators sought. Each clue seemed to taunt them, whispering of a solution just beyond their grasp. The cold air pressed on the detectives' faces, a physical reminder of the frozen trail that refused to yield. Frustration mounted in the small police station. Maps were spread across tables, photos pinned to boards, yet nothing connected. Kincaid felt the weight of each dead end, each unreturned call, each lead that dissolved into nothing. His chest ached with anger and helplessness, a relentless gnawing at the edge of despair. The town waited, holding its breath, and the investigators carried the heavy burden of hope and failure in equal measure. Still, beneath the fatigue and frustration, Kincaid's determination refused to waver. Every blurred footprint, every faded mark in the dirt, was a reminder that Alice had fought until the very end. Even as dead ends multiplied, the promise of justice, distant and obscured, fueled the relentless pursuit. The evidence may have been hidden, but the truth had not disappeared. It was merely waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. The shadow of Alice Collins' murder hung over Wyoming like a relentless fog. Every neighbor became a silent observer. Every passerby, a potential threat. Streets once familiar now felt alien. Homes that had been safe havens were watched with anxious eyes. The town was trapped in a state of hyper-awareness, a constant reckoning with the possibility that evil could be hidden behind a friendly smile. Rumors spread faster than truth. Casual conversations became interrogations. Friendly glances turned into suspicion, and even long-standing friendships trembled under the weight of doubt. People began questioning everything. The late-night jogger, the neighbor returning home after dark, the stranger at the corner store. The uncertainty gnawed at hearts, filling every quiet moment with tension and dread. Mothers whispered to children about strangers. Fathers paused in streets, scanning shadows for signs of threat, and the entire community existed in a fragile balance between grief and fear. Yet amid the tension, Alice's memory remained vivid. She had been an artist, a dreamer, a young woman full of hope and life. Her absence was a wound that refused to heal, a reminder that the town's safety had been shattered, leaving everyone under the invisible gaze of uncertainty. Have you ever walked through your neighborhood thinking you truly knew who lived among you? That very question became a daily reality for Wyoming. Stay with this story because the truth was hiding where no one dared look. Every whisper, every glance, every uneasy step across the quiet streets was a part of the puzzle, a step closer to uncovering the shadow that had lurked in plain sight for decades. The town's collective fear was only the beginning. The investigation, the search for justice, had only just begun. Ford Kincaid had faced death in the trenches of Korea, had endured the chaos of battle and the cold weight of loss. Yet nothing had prepared him for the scene behind Avery's auto body. The brutality, the deliberate cruelty, and the haunting final stare of Alice Collins struck deeper than any gunfire ever could. It was a silent battlefield, one that offered no clear enemy lines, no strategic advantage, only the raw, incomprehensible evil of human violence. Every officer nearby sensed it, the difference between war and this quiet terror. Ford felt a familiar surge of control slip through his fingers. In battle, chaos had rules, even if cruel ones. Here, the rules were gone. The town's streets, the empty auto shop, even the frozen November wind seemed conspiratorial, pressing down on him with the weight of every unanswered question. Each breath felt heavy, each heartbeat a reminder of failure he could not erase. His guilt settled over him like frost, seeping into every decision, every thought. Alice had been inches from the road, a heartbeat from freedom, yet she had been pulled back into darkness. Ford's mind replayed the scene over and over, scrutinizing every detail, questioning every action, every missed clue. Sleep became elusive. Dreams were haunted by Alice's pleading eyes. He could not allow the case to fade into the cold archives, could not let her death remain unanswered. Every step Ford took from that night forward was shadowed by a relentless determination. He was no longer just a detective. He had become the vessel through which justice would demand recognition. The nightmare of 1966 had claimed innocence, but it had not claimed his resolve. Ford would not rest until the truth, however delayed, found its way into the light. Ford Kincaid transformed his office into a battlefield of paper, pens, and ink. Timelines stretched across walls, connecting every moment of Alice Collins' final night, every witness statement, and every fragment of evidence that the frozen November ground had spared. Maps of Wyoming were marked with colored pins, each indicating a point where her footsteps had faltered, where the struggle had left its imprint, where hope had nearly touched the asphalt. He sketched psychological profiles late into the night, attempting to understand the mind capable of such violence. Lines, arrows, and notations filled notebooks, each page a reflection of his obsession. Ford's hands trembled not from age but from the weight of responsibility, from the fury and sorrow that coiled in his chest. Sleep became a stranger. Meals were often forgotten. He measured every angle, questioned every assumption, and challenged every lead, no matter how small, because every detail might be the one thread capable of unraveling the truth. Hours blurred into days, days into weeks. The office became a map of obsession, a visual record of one man's refusal to surrender to failure. Colleagues watched quietly, respecting his commitment but wary of the toll it demanded. Ford's mind was consumed by the puzzle, by the patterns of movement, by the faint traces left in the dirt and on her coat. Yet even as the obsession deepened, Ford remained aware that the smallest detail might hold the largest revelation. One overlooked fiber, one misplaced fingerprint, one minor observation could pierce decades of silence. Each scribble, each map, each sketch carried the hope that justice, however delayed, could be wrested from the shadows that had claimed Alice Collins. Vivian and Hollis Collins carried their loss like a wound that never healed. Each late afternoon, they made their quiet pilgrimage to the edge of the now-razed auto shop, where grass had begun to grow over the spot Alice had fought her final battle. They spoke little, their voices broken, their steps slow, but their sorrow was palpable, filling the air around them like an unspoken accusation at a world that had failed their daughter. Ford Kincaid watched them from a distance at first, respecting their need for privacy. But over time, he began to understand that their grief was inseparable from his own. The image of Alice's pleading eyes intertwined with the pain etched into her parents' faces, each silent visit a mirror reflecting the weight of his perceived failure. He carried their hope and despair alongside his duty, feeling the sharp pangs of guilt sharpen with every footstep they took on that frost-bitten earth. Their private moments became a shared ritual of remembrance and frustration. Vivian would kneel, brushing grass from the earth as if her touch could reach beyond death. Hollis would stand behind her, silent, steady, a living pillar of grief and endurance. Ford often left the site with a tightened chest, a mix of anger, determination, and sorrow pushing him further into the investigation. In those moments, he realized that solving Alice's case was not merely professional, it was moral. The Collinses' grief was both a motivator and a reminder of the stakes. Decades of life reduced to a frozen moment of violence. Ford's obsession deepened, rooted not just in evidence or procedure, but in empathy, in the quiet knowledge that the fight for justice was a fight for those who had already lost everything. Among the scattered papers, sketches, and timelines, Ford Kincaid held on to one small, nondescript envelope. Inside was a collection of biological material taken from Alice's torn coat and broken nails, an item the technology of 1966 could barely interpret. At the time, its significance was vague, almost meaningless, yet Ford sensed its weight, a quiet assurance that the tiniest detail could one day pierce the veil of decades. He handled it with care, as though the fragile evidence were both a promise and a burden. Nights were spent staring at it under the dim glow of his desk lamp, wondering how such a small piece of material could hold the key to an enormous, unsolved crime. Each time he revisited it, he imagined its potential, the silent story it might tell, the truth it might finally reveal. It became a talisman of hope, a secret bridge connecting the horrors of 1966 to a future where justice could finally arrive. Ford's colleagues saw him grow quieter, more consumed by the case than ever before. The obsession that had begun with sketches and maps now coalesced around this envelope. He knew that one day, advances in science or sheer persistence might transform it into the instrument of revelation. Until then, it remained carefully stored, waiting, whispering that even the smallest fragment could expose a monster. If you've ever believed the smallest detail can expose a monster, don't miss what comes next. This was more than evidence. It was a promise that Alice Collins' story had not ended. Every blurred footprint, every faint fiber, every moment of her final struggle carried forward in time, and Ford's unwavering determination ensured that one day, the truth would no longer be hidden. In the Wyoming Police Department, there was a file that carried a reputation older than most of the officers who now walked the halls. Dust had settled on its edges, corners bent from decades of handling, and yet it demanded attention. Younger detectives glanced at it with a mixture of skepticism and mild amusement. They called it Ford's Ghost, a relic from a time before computers, before modern forensics, before the technology that could make sense of decades-old violence. But Ford Kincaid never saw it as a joke. Each year, as November arrived, he pulled the file from its shelf, the familiar creak of the binder opening a ritualistic accompaniment to a ritual of remembrance. Under the soft amber glow of his desk lamp, he traced the lines of typed statements, photographs, and witness accounts, as if hoping the paper itself might whisper the answers that eluded him for 57 years. The officers around him would notice the ritual, nod in respect, then return to their own duties. Some questioned why he clung to a case so long cold, but Ford could not let it go. Alice Collins' life had been stolen with such violent finality, and the details of her struggle were etched into every page of that file. Every unturned leaf, every notation in the margins, was a testament to a young woman who had been so close to freedom, yet pulled back into darkness. The file was more than paper. It was a weight, an echo of failure and hope interwoven. And in that weight lay the quiet promise that nothing, not even the years, could erase the memory of Alice Collins. Among the documents and photographs, one small envelope sat almost unnoticed. Yet it carried a secret that would outlast decades. Inside was a tiny collection of biological material collected from Alice Collins' torn nails, her desperate fight against the force that stole her life. In 1966, it was a whisper in the void, an item too subtle for the technology of the day to interpret meaningfully. Still, Ford Kincaid recognized its potential. For years, the envelope remained sealed. Preserved with painstaking care, Ford handled it with reverence, understanding that although the forensic tools of his time could not make sense of it, the evidence itself was a record of truth. In 1999, just before his retirement, he sent the sample for what would be the first attempt at DNA profiling. The results were inconclusive, insufficient to identify a suspect, a frustrating dead end, but Ford never saw it as a failure. That tiny piece of material held a promise that no report, photograph, or testimony could. The envelope became a symbol of patience, of the slow-moving progress of justice. While the world moved on and the case faded from headlines, this minuscule remnant of Alice's struggle quietly preserved the possibility of resolution. It was proof that even in the coldest, darkest corners, evidence could endure, waiting for the moment it would finally speak. Ford understood something profound about this envelope. Even if the technology did not, the smallest detail could eventually unravel the largest mysteries. It was a tangible connection to the truth, a silent witness to the struggle, and a bridge linking 1966 to a future where Alice Collins' story could finally be told. Ford Kincaid's relationship with the file and the envelope became a private, almost sacred ritual. Every November, as the chill crept into the department, he would sit alone under the soft glow of his desk lamp, the documents spread before him like a battlefield map. He traced the photographs, reread witness statements, and studied the minute fibers and drag marks, each detail a reminder of a young life stolen. The evidence was static, yet in his hands, it felt alive, holding the memory of Alice's final moments and the hope for eventual justice. Days would pass with Ford lost in thought, sometimes speaking softly to the file, as if the paper itself might offer guidance. He bore the weight of decades, the frustration of unanswered questions, and the grief of the Collins family, all of it pressing down on him in a silent, unrelenting vigil. Sleep was fitful, the shadows of his office long companions, but he did not falter. Each ritual reinforced his determination. Alice Collins would not be forgotten, and her case would not remain unresolved. Colleagues came and went, sometimes offering a nod of respect, sometimes questioning the need to revisit a file so old. Ford welcomed neither praise nor criticism. In the quiet hours, with only the hum of the heater and the whisper of paper, he felt the magnitude of the task he had chosen. Justice for Alice was not just a duty, it was a moral imperative, a bridge between the past and a future where truth might finally arrive. Through years of waiting, of watching, and of silently guarding that fragile envelope, Ford held on to a conviction that time could not erode. The evidence, like a sliver of light in darkness, endured, and so too did his unwavering resolve. Over the decades, Ford Kincaid's relentless focus on Alice Collins's case became a point of quiet contention within the department. Some argued that he should have let the file rest, that the years had rendered the pursuit futile, and that clinging to an unsolvable crime only prolonged personal anguish. Others insisted that justice could never be constrained by time, that the smallest detail, the faintest trace, might one day uncover the truth. The debate whispered through hallways, lingering in offices, a reminder that obsession and duty often share the same uneasy boundary. Ford himself never wavered. For him, the line between obsession and justice blurred. The file was more than paper, and the envelope more than evidence. They were promises kept, silent witnesses to a crime that demanded acknowledgement, a record of a young woman's final struggle. Every visit, every review, every note in the margins reinforced the conviction that the truth would endure, even when the world seemed ready to forget. The tension was not only professional but moral. How far should one go for justice? When does persistence become folly? And when does it become heroism? These questions lingered, unanswered, echoing through the quiet offices and the corridors of memory. Some said Ford should have let the case die. Others said justice must wait. What do you think? Subscribe if you believe cold cases deserve a second chance. Stay with this story, because the evidence and the pursuit of truth were only gathering momentum. What seemed impossible in 1966 was quietly, persistently moving toward resolution. Every overlooked detail, every silent vigil, was a step closer to the revelation that would shake Wyoming, Michigan, to its core. Wyoming, Michigan, had transformed over the decades. Streets, once lined with modest post-war homes, gave way to sprawling suburbs, shopping centers, and busy intersections. The town hummed with the rhythm of progress, seemingly unaware of the dark memory tucked into its past. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the shadow of Alice Collins lingered quietly in corners that modernity could not erase. Her parents, Vivian and Hollis Collins, passed away years apart, their grief unresolved, their hope for justice quietly fading with each birthday and anniversary that came without answers. Ford Kincaid, now frail and confined to a nursing home, watched the world continue beyond his reach. The once sharp detective, who had carried the weight of this case through decades of service, now spent his days revisiting memories rather than evidence. Yet his mind remained alert, haunted by the image of Alice's pleading eyes, as vivid now as they were in 1966. In the public eye, the case had all but disappeared. True crime forums discussed it occasionally, small anniversary articles resurfaced in local papers, and a few whispers lingered in conversations among those old enough to remember. The town continued its daily life, oblivious to the quiet presence of a long-forgotten truth. Still, the case file and the tiny envelope within it remained untouched, waiting, a silent guardian of the last, unspoken chapter of Alice's story. Though decades had passed, one fact remained painfully clear. The person who had taken Alice's life was still alive, aging quietly among neighbors and community members who would never suspect the darkness that had lived among them. And in the quiet corners of the Wyoming Police Department, the threads of that cold November night still held the potential to unravel the secrets that had haunted the town for nearly 60 years. Decades passed. Yet the tiny envelope containing the biological material from Alice Collins' nails remained untouched, a quiet sentinel of truth in a world that had nearly forgotten her. Tucked away in the Wyoming Police Department's archives, it survived the shifts in staff, the turnover of officers, and the evolution of forensic methods. To anyone else, it might have seemed inconsequential, a small, yellowed envelope lost among countless other cold case files. But Ford Kincaid had known its significance, and he had ensured it endured, the evidence of a struggle that could not be silenced by time. The envelope held more than DNA. It carried the memory of Alice's fight, the desperation in her final moments, and the faint hope that one day, science would give her story a voice. Each passing year increased the weight of its presence, as if the material itself were quietly demanding recognition. While the town moved on, unaware of the living history that lingered in their midst, the killer aged alongside it. He lived among neighbors, attended community events, and held a respected place in society, all while carrying a secret that had survived for decades. The tension was undeniable. The evidence endured, waiting patiently, while the murderer remained free, his life unfolding unnoticed. Every unsolved case, every ignored detail, every faded photograph became a reminder of how close justice had come and how long it had been delayed. The envelope, so small and unassuming, represented the thin line between closure and continued despair. It was a waiting game, one measured not in months or years, but in decades, and as the world outside changed beyond recognition, the potential for revelation grew, silently promising that the past had not relinquished its grip. As years turned into decades, the weight of unresolved justice pressed silently on the town of Wyoming. The killer, aging quietly among those who never suspected, carried on with life, untouched by suspicion, a ghost walking in plain sight. Meanwhile, the evidence the small envelope Ford had preserved remained a fragile lifeline to the truth, waiting for a hand capable of understanding its significance. The tension was almost tangible. Every time a new officer entered the archives, they glimpsed the file and felt its pull, a silent reminder that some stories refused to rest. The community believed the past had been buried along with Alice Collins, but the past had its own stubborn persistence. The envelope, the fibers, the tiny traces of her struggle all endured, waiting for the day when science could finally speak louder than decades of silence. Questions loomed, gnawing at those who cared to ask them. What happens when new science meets an old ghost? Could the evidence, dormant for so long, finally uncover a truth the town had avoided confronting for nearly 60 years? Every unsolved murder carries this tension, the quiet possibility that even the most meticulous concealment cannot withstand the steady advance of knowledge. The thread of Alice's life, pulled from the dirt that November night, stretched forward through time, taut with expectation. And somewhere, in the midst of suburban normalcy, the man responsible continued his days, oblivious that the past was preparing to confront him. The balance between concealment and revelation had tipped. The world had changed, but one fact remained immutable. Alice Collins' story was not finished, and the dead, when given the chance, have a way of making themselves heard. The passage of time did nothing to lessen the weight of what had been lost, nor the urgency of what was about to be uncovered. Alice Collins' life had been stolen in a single, violent night, and decades of waiting had done nothing to diminish the emotional cost. Her parents, long past, never received the closure they deserved. The town, now thriving and bustling, remained unknowingly entwined with the shadow of a crime that had gone unresolved. Every smiling neighbor, every familiar face, held within them the potential connection to a truth they had never imagined. The killer, who had lived through the decades without consequence, remained oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He had aged, earned respect, and continued a life that, to outsiders, appeared unremarkable. Yet in the silence of the police archives, in the preserved envelope of evidence, the quiet tension built. Every detail Ford Kincaid had safeguarded, every trace of Alice's struggle, became a bridge connecting the past to the impending revelation. The stage was set for confrontation, not just for justice, but for recognition, memory, and accountability. This was the moment where old truths and new science would collide, where decades of waiting would either end in resolution or continue in frustration. Don't blink here, because this is where the dead begin to speak. Stay with this story, because the tiniest trace, the smallest preserved detail, could expose a lifetime of secrets in a single, undeniable revelation. The past had been patient, but it was ready to demand its reckoning. Detective Cassandra Cassie Morales had a reputation that preceded her. Brilliant, stubborn, and unrelenting. Her specialty, forensic genealogy, was a field where patience, precision, and relentless curiosity met, and it was exactly the skill set the Alice Collins case demanded. When the cold case file landed on her desk, she immediately recognized not just a decades-old tragedy, but a life that had been stolen and forgotten for far too long. The injustice weighed on her, a tangible pressure that propelled her into action. Cassie studied the photographs, the witness statements, and the tiny envelope Ford Kincaid had preserved with such care. She could feel the detective's decades of devotion threaded through the yellowed pages. This was not merely a case. It was a responsibility. A chance to give a voice to someone who had been silenced for more than half a century. Unlike those before her, Cassie saw potential where others saw impossibility. Every blurred footprint, every faint fiber, every scrap of DNA contained a story waiting to be told. Her first step was clear. She would honor the past while using the tools of the present. Cassie understood that science could now speak louder than memory and intuition alone. The preserved evidence, ignored by technology decades earlier, could now be transformed into something decisive. She felt a mix of awe and urgency, knowing that the tiniest overlooked detail from 1966 could finally illuminate the path to justice. Cassie's eyes scanned the room, the case file open before her. She didn't yet know who the killer was, or how long it would take. But she understood one truth with absolute clarity. Someone had been waiting for this moment for 57 years, and now, that moment had arrived. Cassie Morales didn't hesitate. She knew that the preserved evidence from Alice Collins' nails held the key, but only the right technology could unlock it. The tiny envelope, decades old, was delicate and fragile, yet it carried within it the potential for an answer that had eluded generations of investigators. Cassie arranged for the sample to undergo advanced DNA sequencing at a private lab specializing in degraded and touch DNA, a process unimaginable in 1966. The lab technicians treated the material with reverence. Every microscopic trace was magnified, analyzed, and digitally reconstructed. The process was painstaking, precise, and tense. As the sequences emerged, Cassie watched each step with unwavering focus, understanding that a single mistake could erase decades of patience and hope. The air in the lab seemed charged with anticipation, as if the evidence itself was holding its breath, waiting for recognition. Every moment was a reminder of the years lost, the lives affected, the grief endured, the answers denied. Yet the excitement was undeniable. Modern technology could now do what human memory and primitive forensics could not: create a complete and reliable digital fingerprint from the fight Alice had waged in her final moments. Cassie could see, in real time, the bridge forming between past and present, a connection that had been invisible for more than half a century. Her mind raced with the possibilities. This wasn't just a scientific breakthrough. It was the first step toward exposing a killer who had hidden in plain sight. Every coded sequence, every amplified signal brought her closer to the truth. Each one a reminder that justice could be delayed, but not denied. The case was alive again, and this time, the past was about to speak in a language no one could ignore. The sequencing was complete, and what emerged was nothing short of remarkable. From a tiny, decades-old sample, the lab had produced a perfect, high-resolution digital fingerprint, a genetic map that carried the unmistakable signature of Alice Collins' attacker. Every strand of data told a story that had been waiting for more than 50 years to be told. A silent witness transformed into undeniable proof. Cassie stared at the screen, the digital representation of a person who had remained hidden for decades. The complexity and clarity of the profile were staggering. What had once been a blurred trace, indecipherable in 1966, now glowed with precision, a beacon pointing toward justice. For the first time, the identity of the killer was no longer a shadow. It was encoded in unmistakable scientific certainty. The implications were immediate and profound. With this fingerprint, Cassie could step beyond speculation, rumor, and theory. The case could now leverage the full power of modern forensic genealogy, connecting fragments of information across decades, tracing familial links, and narrowing the possibilities until only one individual remained. Every calculation, every digital match, would be guided by the certainty of this fingerprint. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed on her. A single misstep could compromise the evidence, and decades of patience would be lost. But Cassie felt a rare clarity. This was more than a scientific achievement. It was a moral imperative, a chance to finally give voice to a woman silenced for far too long. The digital fingerprint was no longer just a string of genetic code. It was a signal, a challenge, a message that the past had not been ignored, and for the first time, the story of Alice Collins was moving from the shadows of history into the light of reckoning. Cassie Morales paused, taking a moment to consider the enormity of what she held. The digital fingerprint was complete, a precise genetic map pointing toward the identity of a killer who had remained free for nearly 6 decades. For anyone else, it might have been just another piece of evidence. For Cassie, it was the key to unlocking a truth long denied. She thought about the family, long gone now, who had lived in quiet hope for closure. She thought about Ford Kincaid, whose life had been consumed by the shadow of this single unsolved murder. And she thought about the town of Wyoming, where the memory of a stolen life lingered, largely unacknowledged. Every decision she made now could honor the past, or risk further injustice. The process ahead would be painstaking, but the promise was undeniable. By tracing genetic markers through public genealogical databases, Cassie could begin to reconstruct family trees, following lines of descent to identify distant relatives, and ultimately, the person responsible for Alice Collins' death. Each connection would narrow the field, each match a step closer to revelation. Have you ever looked at an old problem with new eyes and suddenly everything changes? That's exactly the position Cassie now held. What had seemed impossible for decades was suddenly within reach. The tools of modern science, combined with her relentless determination, were about to expose secrets hidden for generations. Stay with this, because she's about to uncover a family tree that points to a killer. The quiet whispers of the past are ready to speak, and nothing will remain concealed for long. Cassie Morales stared at the screen, the digital fingerprint glowing like a small, persistent flame against the black backdrop of the genealogy database. Every sequence, every coded pattern, represented a piece of a puzzle that had resisted resolution for 57 years. With a careful click, she uploaded the profile to public databases, aware that the tiniest link, some distant cousin, a forgotten branch of a family tree, could crack the case wide open. The process was deliberate, painstaking, and electrifying. Every distant match that appeared on her screen was a thread, stretching back through time, connecting generations, bridging unknown lives. Some matches were faint, almost imperceptible. Others were stronger, hinting at a shared ancestry that could illuminate decades of darkness. Each click, each cross-reference, was a step deeper into a labyrinth of human connections, a maze of possibility that required patience and insight to navigate. Suspense built with every discovered connection. Cassie knew the odds were long. Millions of profiles, countless family trees, endless lines of descent, yet she felt certain that somewhere in this web lay the key. Every distant cousin, every minor match could lead her closer to the person responsible for Alice Collins' death. It was a hunt in which time and technology merged, where decades-old tragedy met cutting-edge science. Her mind raced with scenarios, timelines, and probabilities. How many lives had brushed against the killer without knowing? How many had seen him, spoken to him, welcomed him into their homes? And now, with this single digital fingerprint, she had the chance to peel away decades of anonymity. The hunt had begun, and every tap on the keyboard, every connection revealed, brought her closer to uncovering a truth that had waited far too long. The past, silent for decades, was about to roar. One match stood out: a third cousin living in Oregon. A faint connection, almost insignificant in isolation, yet it became the thread that could unravel decades of silence. Cassie Morales leaned in, tracing the branches of the family tree with methodical determination, connecting names, dates, and locations, moving backward through generations to find the common ancestor, and then forward again toward the present. Each record she uncovered added clarity: birth certificates, obituaries, marriage licenses, each document a stepping stone leading her closer to the elusive killer. The process demanded precision and patience. One wrong assumption could send the investigation down a blind alley. But Cassie's experience and intuition guided her, allowing her to spot patterns others might overlook, to read between lines that seemed mundane, to uncover the subtle links that bound distant relatives together. The map of connections began to focus on Michigan. From the Oregon cousin, Cassie traced multiple family branches that spread across the decades, across towns, and ultimately pointed to the quiet neighborhoods of Wyoming. It was a meticulous dance between past and present, a fusion of historical research and cutting-edge science. She knew she was closing in. Every branch she eliminated sharpened her focus. Every family name crossed off the list heightened the tension. The distant cousin was the spark, but the fire of discovery was about to reach the person who had committed the crime. And as Cassie pieced together the genealogical puzzle, two names slowly emerged, each carrying its own story, its own shadow. One would no longer matter. The other remained alive, unaware that her careful work had illuminated the path straight to him. As Cassie Morales followed the branches of the family tree, the puzzle began to take a chilling shape. Two names emerged from the tangled web of relatives: Orrin Finch and Dorian Hayes. One, Orrin Finch, had passed away years ago, leaving a quiet life behind in another state. The other, Dorian Hayes, was very much alive, living within the same community where Alice Collins had been taken all those decades ago. The realization hit Cassie like a shockwave. The killer had walked among them, celebrated and trusted, while the world had moved on. Every public record, every newspaper clipping, every photo she uncovered painted a portrait of a man who had maintained the appearance of normalcy, of decency, while harboring a dark secret no one could have imagined. The tension in the investigation was palpable, even in the quiet hum of her office. Each step toward narrowing the suspect pool heightened the stakes, and the weight of responsibility pressed down. Cassie knew she was holding the fate of the investigation and of justice itself in her hands. One wrong move could jeopardize everything, but hesitation could allow decades of impunity to continue. Her mind raced through possibilities. How many times had he passed unnoticed? How many had unknowingly crossed paths with him, oblivious to the history he carried? The contrast between the two men, the one gone and the one still present, made the next phase of her work even more urgent. And now, with the suspects identified, the suspense reached its peak. One man could never be held accountable, but the other remained within reach. The threads of the past, finally connecting to the present. Two names, one dead, one very much alive. The revelation of Dorian Hayes as a potential suspect sent a chill through Cassie Morales. A man who had lived among neighbors, attended community events, and guided young students through their futures, might also be the one who had snatched Alice Collins from life 57 years ago. The thought was almost unbearable. Yet every piece of evidence, every genetic link, pointed unmistakably in his direction. Cassie knew that the past and present were about to collide. The digital fingerprint had illuminated the path, the genealogical reconstruction had led her here, and now all that remained was to confirm what her investigation had painstakingly suggested. Every cautious step she took from this point forward carried enormous consequences not only for justice but for a community that had long assumed safety in their routines. The quiet suburban streets of Wyoming, Michigan, seemed ordinary on the surface, yet they held a truth that no one suspected. The man who had taught, advised, and contributed to the town's institutions could be the very shadow that haunted its history. Cassie felt the weight of anticipation pressing on her chest, a tension that had been building since the first upload of the DNA profile. For 57 years, the case had waited in silence, a ghost that refused to be forgotten. Now, the pieces were in place, the suspect identified, and the moment of reckoning loomed. One man had remained untouchable, but not by chance. Time had favored him, yet the persistence of science and the determination of one relentless investigator were about to close that gap. Two names had emerged. One would never face judgment. The other still walked among the living, oblivious that the past had finally caught up. The next move would change everything. The genealogical search had led Cassie Morales to two elderly men, each connected to the digital fingerprint, each a possible keeper of a decades-old secret. One was Orrin Finch, a man who had quietly left the world some years ago, a life that ended without ever facing the consequences of the past. The other was Dorian Hayes, a man still living, still walking the streets of Wyoming, Michigan, still part of the community that had unknowingly harbored a shadow for nearly 6 decades. Cassie stared at the names, the weight of decades pressing down like a physical force. The contrast between the two possibilities was stark. One had passed beyond the reach of justice, leaving only speculation and memory. The other remained within reach, a living puzzle piece that could finally bring resolution to a case long dormant. Every record, every note, every distant cousin matched, pointed her closer to the truth. The tension in the room was electric. The past was closing in, and the smallest misstep could allow decades of darkness to remain unchallenged. Cassie knew she had to tread carefully. She had the evidence, but now she needed certainty. Her mind replayed the details of Alice Collins' case, the frozen earth, the shredded coat, the drag marks in the dirt, and she felt a deep urgency. Someone had taken a life, and that someone was still walking freely. Time itself had become part of the investigation. 57 years had passed, yet the fingerprints of guilt were finally taking shape. Cassie understood the stakes. One man was beyond accountability, but the other was still there, among the living. And every step forward could either confirm the truth or let it slip through her fingers once more. The hunt was down to its final shadows, and all eyes were now on Dorian Hayes. Orrin Finch, once a potential thread in the tangled web of this decades-old crime, was confirmed dead. His passing removed him entirely from suspicion, leaving no chance for accountability, no opportunity to confront the past he may have touched. The relief was procedural, clinical, but it only heightened the gravity of the remaining possibility. All investigative attention now turned toward Dorian Hayes. The focus sharpened, the stakes intensified. Every record, every personal connection, every fragment of his life was examined through the lens of decades-old evidence. Where Finch could no longer be held to account, Hayes remained, alive and accessible, a man whose life had been intertwined with the very community Alice Collins had known and loved. Cassie felt the tension coil tighter. She knew the hours ahead would require meticulous observation, careful planning, and unwavering resolve. Hayes' presence meant that the past could finally meet the present, that a life once stolen could demand justice through the man who had been its thief. Every step forward carried urgency. Every error could allow the killer to fade back into ordinary life, escaping the reckoning that had been decades in the making. The contrast between Finch and Hayes was stark. One had faded from the world unnoticed, leaving only history behind. The other had survived, thriving in a community that believed itself safe. A man who had earned trust, respect, even admiration, while hiding a secret that had cost a young woman her life. The investigation had crossed the threshold from abstract genealogy to tangible pursuit. Finch was no longer a concern. But Dorian Hayes, the living suspect, loomed large, a figure whose ordinary existence masked a dark, undeniable truth waiting to be revealed. All eyes, all evidence, all anticipation were now trained on him. Dorian Hayes was a man who had spent decades cultivating respect. A decorated veteran, he had served his country with honor, earning commendations that hung quietly on walls now faded with age. Later, he became a high school guidance counselor, guiding countless students through their first steps into adulthood, shaping their futures with patience and care. Beyond the school, he contributed to the Wyoming Historical Society, dedicating years to preserving the town's legacy, a figure celebrated for his civic devotion. Yet beneath this public persona, the shadows of 1,966 lingered. The same hands that once guided students, the same presence that comforted families, were now linked to a crime that had terrorized the community for decades. The stark contrast was jarring. The very man who represented guidance, mentorship, and civic pride might also have been the one who violently ended Alice Collins' life. The dissonance was almost unbearable. How could someone embody such light in public while harboring a darkness so absolute in private? Cassie Morales understood the complexity. This duality, savior and monster, was precisely what had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. The town had known his face, had trusted his reputation, had celebrated his contributions, never questioning the hidden violence that had been a part of his past. The investigation now rested on peeling back the layers of Hayes' life, revealing the intersection of respectability and cruelty. Every photograph, every document, every anecdote of kindness was now examined alongside the silent, enduring evidence from 57 years ago. The tension was unbearable. Could a man be both a trusted mentor and a cold-blooded killer? The question hung in the air, demanding attention, forcing the audience to confront the unsettling truth that appearances can deceive, and history can hide monsters behind familiar faces. Now, the question demanded more than observation, it demanded judgment. Can a man be both a savior and a monster? Dorian Hayes had spent decades guiding students, preserving history, and contributing to the community. Yet, the evidence suggested that the same man might have ended a young woman's life in cold, brutal silence. The contradiction was unbearable, a moral puzzle that haunted anyone who considered it. Cassie Morales felt it keenly. She had uncovered the threads that connected Hayes to Alice Collins' final moments, yet the tension of his public image made the revelation almost surreal. Every interaction, every piece of history in Wyoming, Michigan, suddenly carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Neighbors, colleagues, even former students, none could have imagined the truth hidden in plain sight. The story demanded engagement, forcing the audience to confront uncomfortable questions. Was it possible for someone to be both revered and reviled? Could a community reconcile decades of admiration with the shock of revelation? These questions tugged at every instinct, challenging assumptions and demanding reflection. If your gut is twisting right now, good. That discomfort is part of the journey. Follow it, because the next steps would reveal the living thread that tied a respected man to a violent act long buried. Justice, long delayed, was about to confront Dorian Hayes directly, and every moment leading to it mattered. Stay with this story, because the next section will take you from genealogy and theory to surveillance and undeniable proof, revealing the final pieces that would bring a 7-year-old mystery to light. Detectives moved quietly through the streets of Wyoming, Michigan, careful to remain unseen. Every step was calculated, every glance measured. Dorian Hayes had lived decades in the light of community trust, but now, under the watchful eyes of the law, every movement became a clue, every habitual gesture a potential thread to unravel a long-forgotten crime. Cassie Morales coordinated the operation, her focus razor-sharp. Years of genealogical work had led to this moment. The digital fingerprint had isolated Hayes as the living suspect, and now the team had to confirm what decades of investigation had suggested. They followed him discreetly, tracking his routines, his stops at local stores, the way he interacted with neighbors who unknowingly shared space with a man suspected of murder 57 years prior. The tension was palpable, though unspoken. Each day of surveillance added weight to the anticipation. Hayes moved through his life with the ease of someone unaware of the shadows that had begun to converge upon him. To the community, he was still the familiar, trusted figure, retired guidance counselor, local historian, decorated veteran. To the detectives, he was the last living thread to a tragedy that had haunted Wyoming since 1966. Every action, every discarded item, could provide the final piece of evidence. The team remained vigilant, understanding that the smallest oversight could delay justice for another year, or allow a killer to slip into invisibility once more. The quiet streets, once mundane, now held the tension of decades of unanswered questions. And then, as Hayes sipped his morning coffee and stepped toward the trash, the operation hinged on a single moment, a discarded cup that would unknowingly carry the truth of a lifetime. The moment arrived almost without warning. Dorian Hayes, moving through his morning routine as if decades of suspicion were nothing more than a distant rumor, tossed his coffee cup into a trash bin outside a quiet cafe. It was ordinary, mundane, and yet, for the detectives observing from a distance, it was the culmination of years of effort. Every careful step, every genealogical lead, had brought them here. Cassie Morales leaned forward in the van, her breath caught in anticipation. The cup, insignificant to Hayes, would carry the evidence necessary to connect him definitively to the crime that had frozen Wyoming in fear back in 1966. Lab teams had prepared for this possibility, understanding that decades of careful preservation could finally meet the imperfections of a man's daily habits. The detectives retrieved the cup quickly, handling it with gloves and care, knowing it was more than just discarded paper and cardboard. Within it lay the trace of a lifetime's secrets, a fragment of biological material that, when analyzed, could bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. For Hayes, it was invisible. For Cassie and her team, it was the key to decades of silence. Every second felt stretched. The routine act of tossing trash became a turning point. This unassuming object, abandoned without thought, now carried the weight of a frozen November night, the terror of Alice Collins, and the decades-long devotion of detectives determined to bring closure. As the cup disappeared into the evidence bag, the quiet streets of Wyoming seemed to hold their breath. A long, dark chapter was about to meet the light, and all that remained was to confirm what everyone had feared and hoped for more than half a century. The evidence from the coffee cup was sent to the lab under strict chain of custody protocols. Every step was documented, every surface scrubbed, every precaution taken. Forensic analysts knew the weight of the moment. Decades of unanswered questions now rested in their hands. The DNA collected from Alice Collins' fingernails in 1966, the silent testimony of a woman's desperate fight, was about to be matched to a man who had walked freely for 57 years. Hours passed like days. The machines hummed, spinning tiny fragments of life into readable code. Cassie Morales paced quietly outside, her mind tracing the timeline of events, wondering if the results would finally close the chapter or leave them grasping at shadows. Every small movement in the lab was amplified by the gravity of history pressing down on the present. Then the confirmation arrived. The genetic material on the coffee cup matched perfectly, unequivocally, to the profile preserved from beneath Alice's broken nails. A perfect alignment. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of error. The evidence was irrefutable. The man the community had revered, the decorated veteran, the retired guidance counselor, had left a biological trail connecting him to a crime committed over half a century ago. The room fell silent. The weight of 57 years pressed on everyone in the lab and on the detectives monitoring remotely. The past had finally spoken. The long frozen case, the unanswered cries of Alice Collins, the decades of tension, all converged in a single, undeniable truth. Dorian Hayes was the man responsible. For Cassie, the confirmation was both vindication and horror. The threads she had followed, through genealogical data, through historical records, had led to this. Justice, long delayed, was finally tangible, and the next steps would bring the full story into light, revealing a truth that would shock even those who had known Hayes as a pillar of the community. The arrest was quiet, executed with the precision of years of preparation. Dorian Hayes, seated at the Wyoming Historical Society, looked up as detectives approached. His calm demeanor, decades in the public eye, did not falter. Yet when Cassie Morales read his rights, he leaned slightly forward and whispered a phrase that would haunt those present. "I knew this day would come." The words hung in the air, chilling and deliberate. They were not a denial, nor a plea. They were the acknowledgement of a life spent concealing a horrific truth. Every detective in the room felt the weight of 57 years of unanswered questions compress into that single, quiet admission. It was a revelation that made the perfect DNA match even more terrifying, proof of guilt coupled with the cold clarity of a man who had lived with it for decades. For the community, the news would later be seismic. A man they had trusted, admired, even loved, had been hiding a violent secret for more than half a century. For Alice Collins, justice had finally arrived, but it came after a lifetime of waiting, a lifetime of shadows. And for those watching this story unfold, the implications were immediate and personal. Stay with this story because what comes next reveals not just conviction, but the intricate process of closure after decades of silence. If this discovery hit you like a punch, wait until the next reveal. Every detail matters, every clue counts, and the pursuit of truth is relentless. The final proof had been collected, the confession implicit, and yet the story was not over. There were still lessons to be learned, still moments of tension before justice was fully realized. And in the hands of those who refused to forget, the past had finally spoken, and it demanded to be heard. The morning air in Wyoming, Michigan, was crisp, carrying the quiet of a town that had lived decades in routine and trust. Inside the Wyoming Historical Society, Dorian Hayes moved among exhibits he had curated for years, unaware that his past was closing in. Detectives entered with precision, their presence calm but resolute. Every step was deliberate, every gesture measured the culmination of 57 years of unanswered questions. As Hayes was approached, his posture remained steady, the same careful composure that had earned him respect throughout the community. Then, as Cassie Morales read his rights, his voice low, deliberate, and eerily calm cut through the silence. I knew this day would come. The whispered words were not a plea, nor an attempt at deception. They were a chilling acknowledgement, a confession compressed into 5 words that carried the weight of decades. For the detectives, it was a moment of surreal clarity. The evidence had pointed to him for months, yet the human confirmation, the acknowledgement of awareness, made the decades of investigation tangible. It was as if the past and present collided in that room, freezing every person inside in a shared moment of realization. Outside, the town continued unaware, its streets ordinary and quiet. Inside, history was rewriting itself. The man they had trusted, celebrated, and admired was now the center of a revelation that would forever fracture Wyoming's perception of itself. The arrest, though quietly executed, carried an invisible shockwave, one that would ripple through families, friends, former students, and neighbors alike. This was the moment that began to unravel decades of belief, a turning point where justice, long delayed, finally touched the man who had hidden behind years of community admiration. News of Dorian Hayes' arrest traveled through Wyoming like wildfire. Neighbors exchanged incredulous whispers, unable to reconcile the gentle, respected man they had known with the revelation that he had taken a life 57 years ago. Former students paused mid-conversation, staring blankly, memories of guidance sessions and life advice now tainted by the shadow of betrayal. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for decades were paralyzed, grappling with disbelief. The community had celebrated him as a hero, a veteran, a scholar of their town's history. Yet suddenly, every smile, every handshake, every seemingly benign interaction was reframed as part of a life lived in concealment. Parents who had trusted him with their children's futures felt a profound sense of violation, their confidence shattered by the evidence of his hidden past. The cafes, libraries, and church gatherings buzzed with muted horror. Conversations paused mid-sentence as neighbors tried to process the contrast between the man they knew and the man the law had revealed. For Wyoming, Michigan, the arrest was not just news, it was an emotional earthquake, shaking the foundations of a community that had long prided itself on familiarity and trust. Even decades later, Alice Collins' story had remained a quiet ache in the town's memory. Now, with Hayes in custody, that ache surged into collective outrage, grief, and disbelief. People questioned themselves, their assumptions, and their perceptions. How had they been so blind? How could someone who had been part of the community's fabric harbor such darkness? The town, once steady and predictable, was fractured. Conversations were laced with fear and incredulity, and an undercurrent of anger flowed through streets that had once seemed so safe. The arrest had not just captured a man, it had shattered an illusion, leaving Wyoming to confront a truth they had never imagined. The emotional reverberations of Dorian Hayes' arrest cut deeper than anyone anticipated. Friends who had shared holidays, celebrations, and personal milestones with him now struggled to breathe under the weight of disbelief. Trust, once taken for granted, had been obliterated, leaving an aching void in the hearts of those who had considered him a guiding presence. Former students, many of whom had confided in Hayes during formative years, felt a mixture of horror and self-reproach. Memories of advice, mentorship, and encouragement were now inseparably tied to the knowledge that the man they had respected had concealed a monstrous act for decades. The cognitive dissonance left families grappling with anger, fear, and sorrow all at once. Community leaders, church members, and neighbors wrestled with the realization that the face of kindness and civic service could also mask unspeakable violence. The betrayal was personal, immediate, and raw. Conversations once casual and comforting turned into charged discussions of suspicion and retrospection. People questioned every interaction, every gesture of goodwill from the past, haunted by the knowledge that they had unknowingly lived alongside a killer. Meanwhile, Wyoming's media coverage amplified the emotional fallout. Every article, broadcast, and social media post carried a collective gasp from a town that had invested decades of trust in Hayes' public persona. The narrative of heroism was now replaced with disbelief and grief. For many, the betrayal became a defining moment, a fracture that altered how they viewed the people around them. Families held their children closer. Neighbors watched one another with guarded eyes, and a once familiar town now felt like a landscape of hidden threats. The arrest had done more than deliver justice. It had forced a community to confront the stark, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, monsters wear the faces we think we know best. The town's shock slowly evolved into a mixture of anger, sorrow, and reflection. Conversations that once felt safe became charged with caution, as residents grappled with the unsettling reality that someone they admired had concealed such violence. Every handshake, every smile, every familiar face was now viewed through a lens of suspicion and disbelief. Wyoming, Michigan, had been fractured not by crime alone, but by the betrayal of a man they trusted. Yet, amid the heartbreak, the arrest sparked something else. Questions. Questions about perception, judgment, and the hidden lives of those we think we know. Could a person be both a protector and a predator? How do communities reconcile decades of respect with a single, horrific truth? These were questions the town would wrestle with for years, as they came to terms with the duality of Dorian Hayes. For those watching, the story serves as a mirror. How would you respond if someone revered in your town, someone entrusted with shaping young lives, was revealed to be a hidden threat? The emotional stakes are clear. The world can change in a single revelation, and trust can be shattered in an instant. Comment below, how would you react if the town hero was hiding a dark secret? Share your thoughts, your fear, your disbelief. Your voice matters, because in examining the shock and betrayal of Wyoming, we all confront the fragility of assumptions and the need for vigilance in the lives around us. Stay with this story because the next sections uncover the courtroom drama, the final revelations, and the emotional resolution for a town that waited 57 years for justice. Every moment matters, every detail counts, and the story of Alice Collins is far from over. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding evidence that decades had preserved. For the first time, Alice Collins' story would be told not by witnesses or conjecture, but through the unassailable clarity of science. Digital reconstructions illuminated the space around Avery's auto body, illustrating the night that had haunted Wyoming for 57 years. Timelines flickered on screens, sequences of movement, struggle, and resistance visualized with chilling precision. Cassie Morales guided the prosecution through each detail. The preserved DNA, once a barely understood remnant beneath Alice's fingernails, now served as the keystone of the case. With the digital model, the jury saw the positions, the force, the desperation, the choreography of violence that had stolen a young life. Every drag mark, every angle of struggle, every frozen footprint translated into a narrative that demanded attention, respect, and comprehension. The beauty of the evidence was in its clarity. The science spoke without bias, narrating events that no eyewitness could recall with perfect accuracy. Alice's last moments, encoded in the strands of biological material she had fought to leave behind, became impossible to ignore. The room felt alive with her presence, an invisible witness whose courage had survived time, temperature, and decay. For the town, for the family, and for the investigators who had labored in shadows for decades, this was more than evidence. It was vindication. The prosecution didn't just recount a crime, they orchestrated an experience, letting the jury witness the scene as if Alice herself were guiding their eyes, pointing to the truths that had been frozen for over half a century. The trial had begun, but already the weight of Alice's story was undeniable. Every detail mattered, every piece of evidence a voice, and every sequence a revelation. The stage was set for her final fight to be heard. The jury leaned forward as the evidence revealed what Alice had endured in those last, desperate moments. The drag marks, once dismissed as frustrating anomalies, now traced a clear path, a map of resistance, courage, and the sheer will to survive. Every shift in the digital reconstruction mirrored the frantic fight she waged against the hands that sought to silence her forever. The broken nails, preserved across decades, told their own story. They were more than traces of struggle, they were testimony. Small yet indelible proof that Alice had clawed, scratched, and fought back. Each piece of biological evidence became her voice, declaring in quiet, unyielding insistence that she had resisted, that she had mattered, that she had fought with every ounce of life left in her. Cassie Morales's expert narration wove the science into the human story. The jury could almost feel the cold of the November ground, the sharp tear of Alice's coat, the fleeting hope in her final steps toward escape. The evidence painted her not as a victim alone, but as a participant in her own story, one whose struggle left a trail that no passage of time could erase. Outside the courtroom, memories of Wyoming stirred neighbors remembering fleeting glimpses of her life, patrons of the brass rail, recalling her laughter, her friends recalling the quiet dreams of an artist whose future had been stolen. Inside, the courtroom itself felt charged with presence. Alice's spirit, once trapped in a file and forgotten corners of the archive, was now palpable, demanding justice through the language of science. This was more than reconstruction. It was revelation. The invisible became visible. The silent finally spoke. And in that courtroom, 57 years later, Alice Collins had found her voice at last. As the trial progressed, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every exhibit, every sequence, every minute detail of Alice's struggle intensified the emotional weight of the case. She was no longer a cold file in an archive. She had become a witness, narrating her own story through the very evidence that had survived decades. The jury, the attorneys, even the spectators felt the intensity of her presence, a young life insisting on being heard. The prosecution meticulously connected the dots, illustrating how each movement, each mark, and each strand of preserved DNA revealed Hayes' actions. The once invisible struggle between predator and victim was now visible in vivid, undeniable clarity. Each detail amplified the horror of the crime, but also the bravery Alice displayed in those final moments. Her resistance had been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten. But science now gave her the authority to speak. Witnesses and experts testified, but it was the evidence itself that carried the most weight. The digital reconstruction allowed viewers to track the fight from every angle, revealing the desperation, fear, and determination etched into every trace she left behind. Alice's presence was undeniable, her story inseparable from the facts displayed. Emotion surged as the courtroom absorbed the full scope of her last moments. The years of waiting, the decades of silence, the cumulative grief of a community, all converged in this shared space. What had been hidden in shadows for more than half a century now demanded recognition. Every drag mark, every scratch, every preserved piece of DNA amplified the truth. Alice Collins had fought with all her strength, and finally, her courage was being honored. The emotional tension was almost unbearable, teetering on the edge of release. The stage was set for the final act, the verdict that would deliver the long-awaited resolution. The moment arrived. The courtroom was tense, every heartbeat amplified by the weight of decades-long injustice. When the jury foreperson read the words, "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder," the sound reverberated like a thunderclap through the room. 57 years of unanswered questions, whispered fears, and silent grief finally collided with certainty. Alice Collins, who had been voiceless for so long, had secured her justice. Tears flowed freely among those who had followed the case for decades. The Collins family, though long gone, would have felt vindicated, their sorrow transformed into the relief of truth finally revealed. Detective Ford Kincaid, still alive to witness the moment from his nursing home, allowed himself a rare, unguarded breath. The weight he had carried for more than half a century lifted slightly, as though Alice herself were whispering gratitude through the echoes of the courtroom. The digital reconstructions, the drag marks, the preserved DNA, that every painstaking piece of evidence had done more than convict a killer. They had restored Alice's voice, turning silent resistance into undeniable testimony. Her struggle, once confined to memory and files, had spoken loud and clear, proving that truth, even delayed, could not be denied. For those watching, this is a reminder. Justice may wait, but it can never be silenced. Every detail matters. Every piece of evidence preserved matters. And every voice, no matter how long unheard, deserves to be heard. Subscribe so you never miss when justice rises from the cold, when stories long buried finally surface, and when truth finds a way to speak even decades later. The story of Alice Collins reminds us all that persistence, courage, and the pursuit of justice can transcend time. Detective Ford Kincaid sat in his small nursing home room, the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. The arrest report and trial summary lay open on his lap, crisp and official, yet heavy, with a weight that decades of patience had not lightened. For 57 years, he had carried the burden of a young woman's stolen life, a case that haunted him like a shadow that refused to fade. Now, finally, the shadow was lifting. Tears welled in his eyes, unbidden, as the realization settled in. Justice had been served. The man who had violated the peace of Wyoming and extinguished Alice Collins' life had been named, confronted, and convicted. Ford's hands, trembling slightly, traced the words of the verdict. Each syllable felt like a release, a long-awaited exhale of grief, anger, and frustration that had built steadily since that cold November night in 1966. Memories flooded back the frozen ground behind Avery's auto body, the half-frozen fingers clawing at the earth, the wide, pleading eyes that had stared at him as if he could reach across time and save her. Every dead-end interview, every futile lead, every sleepless night spent reviewing statements and photographs, each had led to this moment. For the first time in decades, Ford allowed himself to lean back and simply breathe. The room seemed lighter, almost unrecognizably so. The ghosts of the past had finally found their conclusion, and while he knew he could not bring Alice back, he felt the quiet, undeniable comfort that her struggle had not been in vain. The case that had defined him, tormented him, and shaped his career had finally reached its reckoning. Ford Kincaid, a man who had carried the sorrow of a community and the grief of a family for more than half a century, allowed a slow, relieved smile to cross his face. The long years of waiting, searching, and hoping were over. At the edge of the now quiet plot where Avery's auto body once stood, Alice Collins's grave drew the community together. Grass grew over the exact spot where she had fought her final, desperate battle. But her memory was vivid, unyielding, and finally honored. Friends, neighbors, and even those who had never known her personally came to place flowers, to bow their heads, and to acknowledge the life stolen from them all. The small bouquet of white lilies and chrysanthemums rested gently on the grave, each bloom a testament to remembrance, grief, and respect. Those who had felt the invisible tension of an unsolved crime finally found a moment of collective release. For decades, Alice had existed in memory and in fear. Now, she stood as a symbol of survival, courage, and justice, finally realized. Murmurs of reflection spread through the gathered crowd. People shared fleeting stories of encounters, of glimpses of her laughter, of dreams she had quietly nurtured as an artist. Her brief life, now crystallized in memory and ceremony, reminded everyone that even the smallest presence can leave a permanent mark. It was a sobering reminder that truth and justice, though delayed, can outlive time. Alice's final fight, captured in evidence and honored in ritual, had left an indelible impact on a town that had once trembled in fear. Flowers, tears, and silent whispers combined to create a moment that was not just remembrance but closure. A quiet acknowledgement that, at last, Alice's struggle had been witnessed and her story completed. The grief, once raw and endless, softened into something resembling peace. For the first time in over half a century, the story of Alice Collins felt whole, and the community could begin to reconcile her absence with the justice she finally received. Wyoming, Michigan, had carried a quiet, lingering tension for decades. Every neighborly interaction, every passing stranger, had been filtered through the memory of Alice Collins' unsolved murder. Now, with the arrest and conviction of Dorian Hayes, the community began to breathe again, cautiously, but with relief. The shadow that had hovered over streets, taverns, and schools for more than 50 years was finally lifting. Conversation shifted from suspicion to reflection. Former students, once under the guidance of the man revealed as a predator, grappled with disbelief, anger, and sorrow, but gradually found a path toward understanding. Families, once tense behind closed doors, shared stories, tears, and small moments of gratitude that the truth had finally emerged. Churches and local institutions, once buzzing with rumors and quiet fear, now held spaces for remembrance, for mourning, and for healing. The town collectively honored Alice's bravery, acknowledging that the life stolen had left an imprint that could never be erased. Public memorials and quiet visits to her grave intertwined, forming a network of recognition and respect. The generational trauma, fear, uncertainty, the whisper of danger slowly softened, replaced by stories of resilience and courage. People began to rebuild trust, cautiously engaging with neighbors who for decades had been silently weighed by fear and doubt. In classrooms, in cafes, in local halls, the community discovered that while a predator had hidden among them, the response, dedication, investigation, and justice could restore confidence and human connection. Wyoming had not forgotten the pain, but the community now had a story of endurance, of patience, and of ultimate justice. The healing was neither complete nor simple, but it had begun. The echo of Alice's courage reverberated in every cautious smile, every heartfelt conversation, and every small act of remembrance. Alice Collins' story proved that truth could endure, even when decades of silence tried to bury it. Small details, preserved carefully, held the power to change everything. One tiny envelope, a fragile remnant of a struggle in the cold Michigan night, became the key to justice long deferred. The case reminded the town, and all who heard it, that no matter how long evil hides, it cannot remain unseen forever. The community's healing continued slowly, anchored by the lessons Alice had unintentionally left behind. Vigilance, remembrance, and the understanding that justice, though delayed, is possible. Parents watched their children with renewed awareness. Neighbors observed each other with hope rather than suspicion, and a shared recognition spread that even long-forgotten acts of bravery could shape lives in ways no one could have imagined. Ford Kincaid, now able to finally set down the weight he had carried for over half a century, represented a human testament to persistence, dedication, and the refusal to surrender to despair. His quiet devotion to a case that seemed unsolvable became a lesson. Commitment to truth can outlast time itself. And for viewers, the story delivers a warning and an opportunity. Danger can hide in plain sight, sometimes for decades. Awareness, attention to detail, and the courage to act can be the difference between silence and justice. If this case taught anything, it's this. Never ignore the small signs. Never dismiss the quiet cries for help, and never stop seeking the truth. Subscribe now, so you never miss the stories that reveal the hidden, the unresolved, and the justice that waits patiently beneath the surface. Alice Collins' struggle was not in vain, and her voice, finally heard, continues to resonate. A reminder that persistence and vigilance can bring closure, even after 57 years.